So we're very lucky to have Julian Conrad, who's a hydrologist of the MSc in hydrology and more than 32 years experience in groundwater understanding and work. So he was at the CSIR and then started his own company, GEOSS. How do you say it? GEOSS, there you go. And he's the MD of that, has 27 people working with him. So Julian, we really are looking forward to hearing, and we've got an attentive audience anticipating your talk. Thanks.
Thank you, Hugh. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a huge privilege to be here to present this afternoon. I've got two challenges. This is a very, very large topic to cover in a very short time. And I think there's a wide range of understanding about groundwater in the room. So I've got to get the pacing and the pitch right. So let's go. If we look at the global water balance, if we look at the left-hand column, by far everything is saline. We have the oceans and very much saline water. Only on the globe, only 2.5% of our total global water is fresh water. If we move to that second middle column, you'll see of the fresh water, most of it is locked away in glaciers and ice caps. 2/3 of it, not very much useful. 1/3 of what remains of the fresh water is actually groundwater. And of that, only a small percentage, 1% of that, is actually rivers, wetlands, lakes, and that type of thing. So, oopsie. So if we just go back to the middle column, if I can just emphasize once again, of the fresh water that's available on the planet, so that's the fresh water that we need for irrigation, that's the fresh water that we need for drinking, all of it is basically in groundwater. Only 4% of that occurs as rivers and lakes. So groundwater is pretty critical. It's kind of out of sight, out of mind, but groundwater is really, really crucial. What is groundwater? Groundwater is really that saturated water beneath our feet. So if we look at the left-hand picture, you get the Earth's surface, you go down through sands and clays, and you'll get to a zone where it's completely filled with water. The sands and sediments are filled with water. The fractures and the bedrock will be filled with water. That's what we consider groundwater. The top of the saturated zone is something called the water table. You might well have heard of that. It's a very weird term because the water table is neither level or is it flat, but we just live with that terminology. I threw in that other diagram to the right just to show you that groundwater can occur in certain zones, and drilling deeper does not mean you're going to get more groundwater. It's what the drillers like to tell you, but it's not true. So you've got to be careful. Another term that you're probably familiar with is the term aquifer. Aquifer just refers to any rock formation that has got utilizable amounts of groundwater. So that's what an aquifer is. The other thing is that groundwater behaves pretty much in terms of flowing along the path of least resistance. So your water table pretty much mimics your topography unless it's under pressure, and then it can go in all weird directions and even uphill. And the last thing that I've got on this slide are two key terms: flow rates and storage. Those are the two parameters we really are concerned about. How fast does the water flow and how much is in storage? And that'll all depend on whether it's in the sediments, whether it's in fractures in the bedrock, or where different geological types join one another. Then so the key drivers behind our groundwater really is around rainfall and around the geological setting. So we have these national scale maps of groundwater by having looked at the rainfall distribution and patterns, and then also at the geological types that we have across the country. And from that, on the right-hand map, we've worked out the types of aquifers and typical borehole yields that you'll get associated with those aquifers. So we have these core scale groundwater maps. Further to this, there are two other types of aquifers. We will talk about an unconfined aquifer. That means that that water that's in the sediments is just kind of lying there. It's not under any sort of pressure. And if we go deeper down, it might well be confined. So if we look at that diagram on the right, the upper area, it's an unconfined aquifer, but below the clay layer or whatever, that water might well be under pressure, or the water that's deeper in the ground might well be under pressure under confined conditions. And that's if we drill into those confined conditions, that's when the water comes out at the surface, and we're going to have Artesian conditions. But I've got a photograph about that just now. And then very quickly, there's three real main types of aquifers in addition to the confined and unconfined. and I'm going to go into those now. We talk about a primary porosity aquifer or a primary aquifer. This is where you have sands, sediments, sands, clays, gravels, and so on, and you have the water in those gravels and clays, and that's pretty much a primary porosity or intergranular or porous aquifer, all the interchangeable terms. Cape Flats, for example, if we drive here back across to Cape Town, going across Cape Flats, that's very much a primary aquifer. The Philippi horticultural area on a huge primary aquifer. Atlantis, north of Coburg, very strong primary aquifer going north of the Berg River into the Sunveld, all very, very strong primary aquifer. Aquifer type number 2 is a secondary aquifer. This is where the groundwater actually occurs in fractures and faults and fissures within a hard rock. So we'll then have secondary aquifers, and this is very, very typical of the Table Mountain Group aquifer that we have around us here. That's a secondary aquifer. And the last aquifer type we have are these solution cavities in a karst environment, or dolomites or limestones, where you have these solution cavities and chambers, and that's just filled with water. Van Reynsdorp, Prieska, around Oudtshoorn and so on, you have these types of aquifers. Okay, and then just a little bit more. In the early 1800s, a French hydraulic engineer did a lot of laboratory experiments, and he was able to quantify using maths and physics about groundwater flow. So in this famous equation of his, he could calculate the flow was pretty much based on the cross-sectional area that the flow was occurring through, the hydraulic conductivity of the material that the water was flowing through, and then the hydraulic gradient as well. So he came up with this equation, which is kind of the E equals MC squared for hydrogeologists. But it was the starting point, and he built many more flow equations, and it was really the starting point of quite sophisticated mathematics that could be applied to groundwater. And nowadays, with computing power and so on, numerical modeling of groundwater flow is a very sophisticated science, and it's quite feasible to represent numerically how groundwater conditions occur, how groundwater flow occurs. We can anticipate conditions if you start to abstract groundwater, what are the impacts going to be, and even go further in terms of chemical transport and so on. So it's quite a sophisticated subject, and it does follow mathematical principles. If we just take a step back now to the very, very basics, and I'm just going to step through those bubbles quite quickly here. But the very first question is, where do I drill? How do I know where to drill? So let's start at that very beginning point. So there are many techniques, and I have had endless discussions about water divining and water diviners and how accurate they are and so on. That's not the way to go. And what flabbergasts me is that many landowners or farmers will be prepared to spend about 5,000 Rand on a water diviner, or maybe 7,000 Rand on one that's very good. Yet, drilling a borehole is easily going to cost 150,000, 200,000 Rand, but penny-wise, pound-foolish with this approach. So it's certainly not recommended. What we do is we really look for geological clues. You can start with Google Earth, and start to look where are the faults, where are the fissures. Start to look at the geology maps. We know that groundwater relates to geology maps, and start to build up a two-dimensional picture of the whole setting. What's also very, very useful is to do what we call a hydrocensus. It's like a population census, but it's a hydrocensus, and we go and look for boreholes on neighboring properties, get anecdotal information. What happened? Why was this borehole drill dry? Why was it successful? So we try and build up a picture around the whole situation. Also have to map the geology in the field. And then there are geophysical techniques, which are electronic techniques to understand the geology more and more. So what we're trying to do is get a very good picture of the geology, because groundwater does follow logical principles. Geophysical techniques, the ones that we use, there are three that we use commonly. That's using a magnetometer to pick up a magnetic field. We use that a lot in the Karoo, looking for the dolerite dikes and sills. You can use a resistivity method, which really tells you how solid the rock is. And then there's also an electromagnetic method that's also going to give you further information on the geological formation. There is no machine that will show you groundwater. So what we've got to do is try and figure out the geological setting as best as we can. And then I'm just going to take you through a very quick story here. I hope you can see it all right. Manager's house on a farm, very low yielding. We were asked to have a look at this. Had a look at the geology maps, and that sort of diagonal dashed line is a big geological fault, so there's already a good clue that we're going to look at a bit further. Geological maps have offsets and inaccuracies, so it was a good idea to run a geophysical survey across that fault and through the farmer's borehole to have a look. That's what a resistivity profile shows us. It shows where there is very solid rock, but it also gave a very nice indication of where the fault actually was, and we could actually see the fault. We could see the fault in the field as well. So now we're getting a pretty accurate picture of the mapping, the profile. We'd seen that the manager's borehole had been drilled into solid rock completely away from the fault. We had then targeted the fault, which we'd picked up, and we were very successful. So there's some logic to all of this, much better than going with the diviner. The magnetometer works very, very well in the Karoo. There's wind pump number 2. It's on a dolerite dike, so very low yielding, and they asked us to have a look at that. So ran a magnetic survey across the dike, and that means something to us, and in terms it gives you the whole shape of the dike. That's where it was drilled, that low yielding hole. It was on the wrong side of the dike, and the dike really acts as a dam wall. And so we positioned it up gradient, and so you can see wind pump number 2 was drilled on the wrong side of the dike. The new borehole was drilled up gradient of the dike and drilled deeper because we wanted to go for those confined aquifer conditions. So we went through the shales into the sandstones, and once again, we were successful there. I think it was 200 liters per hour was that first hole, and the next hole was about 30,000 liters per hour. So it's just figuring out what's going on. It's not to say that we're always successful. It might require drilling 2 or 3 holes. And I must add, it all depends on the geology. If you're sitting in a macroland and we have to site something near Vredendal, for example, there's no rainfall. There's 130 mils of rain a year. It's solid granite. You're not going to get water out of that. So we're very realistic in saying that, hang on, there's no hope here whatsoever, or this is what you're likely going to get. So we've marked the spot. What next? You have to get a reputable driller. Don't go for the cheapest driller. Make sure you have references for that driller, because there are some horror stories of drilling that certainly occurred around the day 0 scenario. Make sure they can drill in a certain geological setting. If they're drilling in sands, make sure they can drill in sands, et cetera, et cetera. There are totally different constructions. There's different techniques. They must understand what borehole development is, and they must be able to record everything. They must put out geological samples, they must record where the water strikes are, what the yields are, et cetera, because all that information is useful to us. Moving along just quickly, on the left-hand side is an artesian borehole, and that's just when the water flows by itself out of the hole. That is actually a bad scenario if it's not all managed. You will know whether you're going to drill and likely to get artesian conditions. You have to prepare for that, because if you don't prepare for that, you can't seal it. And you have to seal that flow, because if you don't seal that flow, there's going to be all sorts of consequences. You can end up drying up springs. You have to actually get a license for it. So strictly speaking, if you drill an artesian hole, you must be able to close it off. And I've seen cases where entire farms have lost all their water and all their spring flows have dried up because of some drilling of an artesian hole that they couldn't manage. And then the picture on the right, be very, very skeptical when you see photographs like that. It is very easy to create a photograph like that, and you'll see it in social media and so on. Drilling in hard rock, you drill with compressed air to drive the whole process. You can leave a borehole stand overnight or 2 or 3 days, and then your drill rod's at the bottom, and you just open the compressor and you blow all that water out, and it looks fantastic, but there is no flow coming into the hole. So be careful of that. It's easy to over-advertise the success of a borehole, especially if you're paying for it. Okay, so now we've got a borehole. It's yielding water. How much water is in that borehole? Another key question, and be careful of what the driller tells you. There are also very quick ways of testing the yield of a borehole which are dangerous. They can be misleading. So there are clear SABS or SANS guidelines on how to yield test boreholes, and also there are very clear standards on water quality, on groundwater quality, be it for drinking or irrigation. Just very quickly moving through this topic. This is all around determining the sustainable yield of boreholes, and this can be done, and can be done pretty accurately as well. It's going to tell you where to put in the pump. It's going to tell you where your cutoff switches must be. It's going to tell you what your pumping schedules of the boreholes must be. It's going to tell you likely impacts on neighboring boreholes. So you have to go through this process properly. There are no shortcuts. There are clear guidelines on how long you need to test the borehole for, typically 24 hours, 48 hours, or 72 hours, or it can even go in for days if you're doing municipal supply and so on. Agriculture, pretty much we want to do a 24-hour test on that borehole. And that's just a graph of the water level in the borehole. So the left-hand line going down, it's just the water level dropping in the borehole. So at the start of the test, we'll pump it at a faster rate. We step up the rate like at least 4 or 5 times, so the rate gets faster and faster, and we pull the water level down to the pump. That tells us how fast the water can flow into the hole, and then we let the borehole recover, and then we start what is known as a constant discharge test. It's important that the flow rate thereafter is kept constant. So we will then pump it at a constant rate. That's for the 24, 48 hours. And the profile of how the water level drops is critical for us, because that can now be analyzed. We can use formula and so on to determine what the safe yield is. Your constant discharge test will come to an end after that period, and then that recovery curve, that's the water level coming back up. That recovery curve is crucial. If your water levels aren't recovering, then you know you're mining the water, or if they recover very quickly, then you know you're dealing with a very strong aquifer with a lot of fast flow back. So those 3 components are crucial for calculating the safe yield of a borehole. These are the type of curves you'll see on the constant discharge. I'm not going to go into the detail here, but these curves tell us a huge amount. And the profile of them, and that's just the constant discharge test, water level drawdown. And you can apply formula to those, and we get a lot of information from these type of curves. Okay, and as I said, it can all be mathematically calculated and addressed. So very quickly, we need the geological information. Don't skip that step. The driller has to give you all the geological information. That helps us with that first red block information about the borehole. The next one from our test is we get critical information that you can pump this borehole at such and such a rate. You should rest it for so many hours a day, for example. And then also, around those management things. And then the third thing that I want to show, that last row, is from the testing, we'll know where your pump should be installed. Don't install the pump below the fractures, because that's going to be a disaster. So your pump depth from all the testing and drilling, we'll know where the pump should be installed. We'll know what the critical water levels are and what the dynamic water levels will be, so you can figure out the correct pump sizes and so on for the borehole, and then also what the rest water levels. So you get good information out of this process. And then we also talk about the cone of depression. So this is the kind of shape of the drawdown curve that occurs to the pumping borehole. And also those equations can tell us how far that cone of depression is going to extend. Are we going to be impacting other users? Are we going to be impacting surface water flow and so on? So that also helps us a lot. Nowadays, we have very good camera logging techniques. And camera logging is super useful. If you know nothing about a borehole, you can always camera log it. Photograph there showing us how well the casing is seated on the bedrock. It shows us the orientation of the fracture zones. We can figure out where the main fracture zones are, and which is all useful information. So we have a really nice camera that does lenses both down and sidewall, so we can inspect, the condition of screens, are the screens clogging, and all good information like that as well. So that's an easy thing to do, is to do borehole camera logging. If I move around our circle of sustainability, and I'm really going to go through this, Hugh, very quickly. It's around legislative requirements. I don't want to dwell on this, just to drive home the point that all the water in this country is owned by the state. So if you're going to use water, then you have to get permission to do so. And it's all controlled by the National Water Act. Very, very briefly, there are a whole list of activities. So if you're abstracting water, if you're storing water, if you're impacting the flow of water, if you're impacting the riverbank, if you're going to be discharging something into water, etc., you are probably going to license an activity under Section 21. So you have all of those. We deal mainly with section 21A, taking water out. And then it depends on the volume that you plan to abstract. Schedule 1 is very small use. It's domestic use. It's the boreholes that you have at home and so on. Not a problem, not a big issue. In 1998, borehole and groundwater use was kind of documented, and what was used to that point was considered existing lawful use. So that was sort of set to one side. Then you fall within a general authorization. So each catchment across the entire country has a certain volume that you are allowed to abstract depending on your property size. So you do that calculation. Maybe you're within a general authorization, which is all good, not too complicated. But if you exceed the general authorization, then you have to go into this whole process of a license application. Then you've got to work through that. And the license application, it's kind of divided into phases. You'll see on the left-hand side, we have to go through 3 phases to get that application submitted. Thereafter, we hand over the baton to the Department of Water and Sanitation, and then they go through a process of specialist review. It goes through this committee called a WOC, and they assess it. It then gets signed off at the regional office. It then goes to head office. They then hopefully sign it off, and after that, it gets captured onto a water authorization and registration management system. It is a lengthy process. Okay, let me finish off with the final thing, which is absolutely critical and really cool. It's around the monitoring and management of your boreholes and water levels. Why do we monitor? Sure, we did a short-term test that might have been 3 days or something, and you're going to be using that borehole for the rest of its life and so on. So we want to make sure that what we recommended is correct, so we need to monitor. And monitoring has got very sophisticated, and it's kind of quite easy nowadays. So we want to make sure there's no contamination occurring in certain situations. We want to make sure we comply with our license regulations, because if you're fortunate to get a license, it's going to come with pages of compliance conditions, and monitoring is part of that. Environmental situations, you also need to keep an eye on that. And the critical thing is to optimize your abstraction. So by monitoring, you can make sure that you are really, that you've got your abstraction optimized. No point in having a very shallow water level. Use that water, that's perfect. It will recover. Pull it down to close to pump inlet and so on. So optimize the use of the borehole, but make sure that you're doing it sustainably. So through monitoring, we can do all of that. Monitoring is focused on 2 things really. Quantity, how much are you taking out, and how the water levels respond in the borehole. So that's pretty easy. And then quality. That's what you've got to keep a track of. Just quantity and quality, not too complicated. To do so is very straightforward in terms of the infrastructure required at the borehole. Here we have a production borehole. It has a flow meter, so you can measure the flow rate, which is important. It has a totalizer, so you can measure the total volume of water coming out of that borehole. It then has a vertical 32 mil HDPE pipe, which goes all the way down the riser pipe of the borehole and rests on the shoulder of the pump. But then you've got a dedicated pipe where you can put in a dip meter to measure water levels. You can put in water level sensors. You can put in loggers. So you don't want to get tangled up with all the electrification and so on that's down the hole. So you have a dip meter tube and then a nice sampling tap just at the borehole. So you're not sampling from tanks or far away, that you're sampling the borehole at the borehole. That's all. That's all you need for monitoring. And then the tools are really nice, pretty sophisticated, that you get loggers. So it's a sensor that will measure the water level in the borehole, and it's completely self-contained. It's got a 10-year battery life. It can store 150,000 data points. So you can just drop that down your observation tube on a piece of string or rope or stainless steel wire, recover it whenever, and you're going to get amazing data of how your water levels are responding. You've got dip meters and all of that. So there's lots of really nice instrumentation around for monitoring. So that would be a typical monitoring graph. That's something that we get pretty excited about. That top right graph is the water level in the borehole. Just think of the top of the graph as being at the surface, and as that water level dips down when the pumps are switched on, you can see how it pumps and how it recovers. And so from that, it's a really useful information. And the green at the bottom just shows us temperature. That also shows us useful information of how the pump is running, that it's not overheating, that it's not pumping against resistance, that you don't have leaking pipes. So just the water levels and the temperature, really useful data. And what we've got there connected to a borehole is just real time. It's pretty sophisticated now in terms of just getting that data through telemetry straight onto some sort of web interface. And right now on my phone, I can check exactly the status of Merverville's water supply, its reservoirs, all the boreholes going into Merverville, for example, the Clay and Karoo scheme. You can have a look at it right now. And for probably about 50 farms that we are monitoring real time as well in the Western Cape. So the technology is all there. It's kind of all stable. It's all cloud-based. It's really a nice progression in that regard. So the monitoring is crucial. Once again, that top right-hand graph, that's now 7 or 8 years of data. So that's each season. And you can see right in the beginning, that horizontal line is where the pump was actually at. They were switching on the pump, and the water level was drawing right down to the pump, which is really bad news. That's not on. That's not sustainable. You're going to burn the pump out as well. At least we could rectify that, and then you can see for years and years, and even going through the drought, how the water levels responded so nicely, the drawdown in summer and then the recovery in winter. So in the longer term, it's really a good way to monitor your holes, and you get critical information like that. Okay, so I mentioned that monitoring is crucial for sustainable use, for optimal use as well. The water's there, use it, it's going to recover. To look at how your infrastructure is working, and also just for informed management about your entire water supply on the farm. Okay, so we've gone very rapidly, kind of around the groundwater circle or cycle. I think we've done quite well. We've talked about scientific borehole siting. We've talked about the proper ways of yield testing boreholes. We've talked about how water quality can be compared to standards. Keep an eye on that. We've talked about that it's quite a sophisticated science if you want to take it there with numerical modeling and so on. Authorization is required, and I think it's very important for the international role players that they are using their water in an authorized way. We've talked about monitoring, and the lead on from that is management. So sure, we can look at optimal development and certainly sustainable management of our groundwater resources. There is tons of information on groundwater. Otherwise, contact me, and I'll gladly help you in any way possible with regard to groundwater. Thank you.